Now it's time for the second part of our foundation, and that's the bass. Now the bass line really carries the weight of our record and oftentimes can be a feature. And the bass line is critical for any rhythm, but in electronic music it can be a different beast altogether. Now the way I approach bass lines is I break it up into two sections, the patch and the pattern. Now the patch is the actual sounds that I use to create that bass line, and the pattern is the actual pattern of the bass line itself. And sometimes I'll want to focus on the pattern first, so I'll just bring up a simple bass instrument or a piano and I'll play around until I get the perfect pattern. Other times I'll want to focus on the sound first and worry about the pattern later. The good thing here is that you don't have to do one or the other first, and they can happen independently. The idea is to stay creative as much as possible. Let's add a software instrument. We're going to focus on the pattern first. So I want to make sure the Open Library is checked. We're going to click Create. And I'm going to come down here to the Bass folder and I'll come over to Electric Bass, and I'm just going to bring up the Aggressive Fretless. And we just want a simple bass sound that's going to allow us to focus on the pattern first. So when I play this, alright, I actually want to pitch that down a little lower so it can sound a little bassier. And I can do that on my MIDI controller. Or in Logic, you can come up to the upper left-hand corner in the MIDI through parameters box and come down to transposition and drop it down an octave to -12. And that's going to allow it and be in a better bass frequency range. So we're going to talk about 4 different types of bass patterns. And the first one is on beat, an on-beat style bass pattern. The second one is a throbbing or 8th note style bass pattern. The third is sustained notes, and the fourth is more of a melodic bass pattern. And let's go into these in a little further detail. So what I'm going to do is let's just mute the vocal real quick, and I just want to loop the beat and turn up the bass a little bit. Now the on-beat pattern really just focuses on the downbeats or something very obviously with the beat. So using our root note, which is A, we're just going to play along with the kick drum. So obviously that's a real simple on-beat style pattern, so it really follows what the drums are doing. The second would be a throbbing bass pattern, and that's going to be on the upbeat or the 8th notes. And that's going to give kind of a push-pull feel back and forth between the drums and the bass line. And that sounds like this. And you can play as much as you want, but it kind of gives it that throbbing feel. Now the sustained is just simply sustained notes, so it'd be just kind of held sustained notes. All right, and then a melodic bass line would be using our scale, which is A minor. We can use any notes within that scale and just play around with a cool melody. So some sort of melody pattern. Now for our bass line, let's go ahead and unmute the vocals again, and we're going to loop verse 1. And the bass line that we ended up using sounded just like this, which was kind of like a melodic pattern mixed with a throbbing, because we ended up going down an octave on the A note. It sounded like this. Okay, that's what we did. So let's go ahead and record that. And now when I played that, I ended up going down an octave, which sounds pretty low in this bass patch, but already I kind of thought about maybe a different musical sound that we'll focus on later to kind of bring out that down, that octave down note. So we're going to go ahead and record this, but the first thing I want to do is click and hold the record button, and I'm going to come into the recording settings. And that's going to bring up these preferences, and underneath MIDI where it says overlapping regions, I'm going to change that to create take folders. And what that's going to do is as I loop this, and let's just bring up a 4-bar loop, as it loops it's going to automatically create different takes for each time it loops back. So we'll go ahead and record. Okay, So now we recorded it a couple times, and you can see there's a little drop down arrow to the left side and the right side of that MIDI region. So if I drop this down, you can see both takes that we recorded. The one on top is our first take, and if I click that, it lets us hear the first take. If I click the one below it, that's our second take. So this is really great for just looping and creating a groove and experimenting with the pattern, getting really creative, and then you have all those takes nicely organized for you. So let's go back to the first take, and we'll collapse that. Now once you find the take that you want, you can either leave the take folder, or you can come over to the right, click on this other arrow, and then you've got all these different options here. You can select the different takes. You can rename each take if you like one or the other, if you do different types of patterns. Or you can flatten it, which will basically merge, or unpack it to new tracks if you like, multiple patterns. So we'll go ahead and flatten this, and it just makes it a nice little MIDI region. And we'll double click this and take a look at it. Now the timing looks pretty perfect because at the top in our MIDI parameters up in the inspector, the quantize is set to 16th notes. So I want to talk real quick about quantization. Now when you're recording audio instruments MIDI inside the DAW, quantization snaps the MIDI notes that you record to the grid inside Logic. Now the values that it snaps to is basically something that you choose. And we come over here in the upper left hand parameter box at the top where it says quantize. Now if I double click the MIDI region, it opens up the piano roll. And notice these notes are perfectly lined up on the grid. That's because Logic has quantized them or snapped them to the nearest 16th note. Now if I come up to the quantization values and switch it to eighth notes, it snaps it to the nearest eighth note. If I go up to quarter note, it snaps it to the nearest quarter note. Also, you can see in the list that you can turn it off, and when you turn it off, then it goes back to the exact way that you played it in. And a lot of times, I'll have quantization turned off because I want to retain that live feeling from when I played it. And when you're recording live instruments, there is no perfect quantization or perfect timing, so I like to have a little bit of that swing. And actually, there are quantization values that try to reproduce this, and you can see there's all these swing grooves. Now the swing quantizations, when you select for example 16A swing, notice that it quantizes it, but what it does is it quantizes it with a little bit of swing. And the key here is just to listen to a swing that may or may not sound good and apply it if you want to use it. Now if I'm using quantization, I generally just leave it to 16th note quantization. Okay, so we have our bass pattern, and you always want to refer back to the vocal. Now I've set up a loop of the first verse and the chorus vocal parts, and we want to make sure that this is really working. And as I'm writing the bass pattern, we'll always refer back to the vocal, make sure it fits exactly where we want it. So I'll play this back, bring up the mixer, and sometimes it's a good idea to solo the kick, the vocal, and the bass line. Let's loop the bass line out. Now if I hit Option and click a solo, it's going to unsolo everything.